4. Why won't you speak to me, Tanis? It had been the end of second day, after Tanis's half-full auditorium presentation on pressure valves. It had been a long day. It had been dry, ironic for a water company, but she had been factual and focused on the potential savings that the valves would bring, which could be passed on to customers. But we are not like energy companies. One conference delegate, from Thames Water, our customers can't choose between us. We have a captive market. We can keep that money as profit. Even so, Tanis had replied. You will be saving money on these devices, which North staffs are installing, and have been proven at Scottish and Anglian. There had been muttered discussion at that, and, after some further discussion about industry specification and manufacturers, she had been thanked and Tanis had left the podium to some applause. It was hardly the Gettysburg Address. And so, Tanis had been hoping to eat her dinner alone so she could consider how best to use the next few days of the conference, which speakers to hear, whether there was anything to add to her own research which would improve it. So, sitting as she was alone in the cafeteria, reading through her notes, she dropped her fork, surprised as she was at being spoken to, more surprised that it was Phil. I texted, he added, smiling and then picking up her fork from the floor. Tanis smiled weakly. She wasn't prepared for company, not least Phil's. You made yourself perfectly clear, Tanis replied as Phil sat down opposite her, hoping she sounded reasonable. I proposed to Kimberly. I couldn't be dishonest. But you are my friend. It is what I see you as, Tanis. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, his palms outwards, as if pleading with her to listen. Tanis sagged inwardly. It did make sense. But it was not how she interpreted it. It can happen could only be interpreted by a reasonable person as an absolute, out-and-out rejection, and not what he was now suggesting, that it was with respect to his recent proposal. Why bother me now, she thought, then said, Phil, talk to me professionally from now on. I only see you as my work colleague. Tanis looked down, to protect herself from the hurt she knew she would see on her former friend's face, and, gathering together her documents, left her half-eaten dinner and Phil. But he did not remain at the table. Instead he got up, hurrying after Tanis, urging her to listen. This is a professional matter, he said at last. Fine, thought Tanis, turning to him. Will you listen? Can you help? Okay, just tell me, Tanis said, resignedly, folding her arms, ignoring the hurt on Phil's face. It's about the redundancies, he began. Tanis nodded, hoping that it seemed she knew what he was talking about. It's just, obviously, he stammered, with getting married, and the expansion at Derby. Can you ask Scarlett about what's going on? I'd be happy to transfer. I just can't lose my job. Now we've paid for the venue, and so on. Ask her yourself. A part of Tanis screamed at him, silently. She closed her eyes, attempting to regain her self-control. I'll try, Phil, Tanis nodded. Then, before he could speak to her again, she turned on her heel and strode away. 88,888,888. How happy Tanis was when she could catch the train with Scarlett, till Chad and Colin back home. How happy not to hear about pressure valves, purification challenges, biofilters and pipe work. It wasn't the conference's fault, but ever since Phil had come to speak to her, she had just wanted to go, to leave, to escape back to Clover Farm and to Doug Price. And now, at last, early in the morning, this bright, August Saturday morning, she was driving up to the Peak District, hoping she had timed it so that Doug would just have been finishing with the Guernsey girls. As she pulled up into the driveway, the wooden farmhouse gate leaning open as if she were expected, she turned off the car engine and looked around, at the beautiful scenery, at the hills and dales beyond the manifold's escarpment. As her eyes feasted on the view, Doug Price ambled out of the dairy, the cows following after him and out to their grazing. When Tanis saw him she smiled, her doubts that had been in her stomach draining away to be replaced with a fizzing, sparkling, sprightly mountain spring of excitement. I would have called last night, Tanis bubbled, her face reddening. To see if you wanted me to come up. Doug stared at her for a minute, and then smiled, walking slowly over to her and placing a hand on the bonnet of the car. "I didn't have your number. I wouldn't have heard it, in any case, if you did call," Doug replied. Then, when he continued to look at the car, Tanis added, "If you're busy I can go. You did say call anytime." Doug smiled again. "And it's good to see you." He looked critically at Fiat 500 again. "This car's not really suitable for roads like these. Thought you were coming last night?" "Sorry. I had to stay late at work, to finish reports. And I don't have your phone number?" Doug nodded, and recited into her. Tanis pulled her phone from her pocket and typed it in, hastily. "Well, you're here now, and I'm happy for it." Then, when she slipped her mobile away, he held out a hand. Tanis took it, shouldering the bag she had brought with her. Just in time for breakfast. 88,888,888. Tea was all Tanis wanted, though Doug cooked eggs for her and she ate them, realizing she was hungrier than she thought. "I have something for you," Tanis said, after volunteering to wash the dishes. "There," she added, gesturing towards the cotton tote bag on the table. "For you," she pressed, when Doug didn't move. "And what did I do to deserve this?" Doug asked, placing the bottle of navy rum and sachet of pipe tobacco on the oak table, the red-brown spirit absorbing the light and creating a distorted spectrum against the wood. "I thought you'd like them," Tanis said, simply. I surely will." Doug nodded. Then, he dragged back his chair, making towards the door. "Make yourself at home. I've got to clean out the stalls. Not pretty." But Tanis got up, too. "Well, come on then, show me what needs doing." 88,888,888. It wasn't as bad as she had envisioned. The cows were in the field, the manure needed shoveling and the stalls needed hosing down. Where to start, Tanis thought, watching as Doug reversed the tractor into the barn's open doorway. Pitchfork in hand, Doug began to shovel in the used straw, explaining it would compost and a farmer from Wetton Mill would come by for it. The compost pile was in a separate field, and while Doug drove the tractor full, Tanis took the hosepipe and hosed down the remainder. "They've got a palace to come back to now," said Doug, leaning on the broom. Tanis turned quickly, for she hadn't heard the tractor, and slipped in the muck that she'd hosed to the front of the stalls, falling flat on her back. "Steady," called Doug, dashing to help her up. "You're hurt?" "No," Tanis said, as he hauled her up. "Come on, let's get you cleaned off." 88,888,888. "So you didn't bring a change of clothes?" Tanis, having staggered into the hallway, for a second time, was standing in the cottage in her underwear. "I bought clean undies, and a toothbrush as you suggested. I thought these would last." "I'll get them in the washing machine," Doug said, shaking his head in amusement. He disappeared through a door which was opposite the one through which they had come. Tanis shivered, despite it being a warm day, feeling a little self-conscious, but glad she had been wearing decent underwear. "Here," Doug said, as he returned moments later, "maybe this is something you can put on?" Tanis took the navy blue dressing gown gratefully, pulling it on, the smell of engine oil and pipe tobacco filling her nostrils. "Do you want a bath? It's all in your hair." Tanis nodded. "I can do it myself," she added. "I seem to be making a habit of baths at your house." "Right," nodded Doug. "You go ahead. I've got to feed the hens, and a fence to mend. Your clothes'll be clean in no time." 88,888,888. They were. In fact, they were clean and dry. Despite there being a washing line strung out in the yard, Doug had a washer-dryer. It had done a good job, though there were gashes to the fabric where she had, ironically, skidded her feet against the edge of the non-slip rubber matting. Her back was going to be bruised, too, Tanis knew, from her bath, for it was painful getting back out. Doug had pushed open the bathroom door and hung her clothes over the door. "I've caught up on the jobs," Doug explained happily, as Tanis emerged reclothed. "How do you fancy a walk?" Dennis agreed, though a quarter of a mile and she wished she hadn't. She should know by now, she told herself firmly, that she was not cut out to be a walker. In contrast, and despite his near 20 years older, Doug was stepping lightly, like an alpine mountain goat. "We can go this way," he called, pointing between two boulders, beyond which the manifold lay, coiling round its riverbed like a sinuous snake. "Thor's Cave is just over there," Doug pointed, at the dark round circle that was one of the Peak District's most famous landmarks. And, as he slowed his pace to keep up with Tannis, explained about the ancient Angle burial mounds that few people knew about all over the moorlands. "Mam said Anglo-Saxons settled here, 'cause of the land, 'cause of the water." He pointed to Ilam, one hand on his thigh as he rested a foot on a large limestone boulder. "There's a big exhibition over by the National Trust about it. We could go tomorrow, after the cows are milked." "Sounds good," Tannis nodded, and they headed back around the lower edge of Doug's land and back up towards Halden village. "And who's this?" inquired a large, tall lady, hair in rollers under a tweed hat, dungarees covered in white paint and a paintbrush in the same color in one hand. She was peering down at both Tannis and Doug as they passed by. "Tannis Haviland," she said, offering a hand. The woman looked at her hand disdainfully. Tannis withdrew it, her face warming in discomfort. "Tannis is helping at the farm, Margaret," Doug said, smiling. The woman looked Tannis up and down, then said, "Well, you move fast, Doug Price, that's all I can say." Once Doug had bid Margaret a curt farewell, they walked on in the direction of the Royal Oak. "That's my sister-in-law, Catherine's sister. She lives the other side of Halden." He held the door open for Tannis, then added, "Pub? Drink?" Tannis nodded, despite feeling uncomfortable. The coldness from the woman could have been used to refreeze the polar ice caps. "Look," said Doug, closing the door, when Tannis had not gone through it. Taking her hand, he led her to a wooden bench set outside the pub, and sighed deeply. "Look, it's been gone nigh on 10 years since Catherine died," Doug began, though to Tannis it was as if he was talking mostly to himself. Then his speech dropped to nothing, and he looked away. Tannis wrapped her other hand around his and squeezed it, gently. "A beer would be good," said Tannis, and within 5 minutes Doug had disappeared inside, bringing with him a pint for himself and a half a pint for her. Tannis smiled, the age difference between them telling. A half a pint in front of her. Doug wiped the froth from his moustache with his arm. "You'll stay tonight?" asked Doug, as they walked back to Clover Farm. "Then we can go to Ilam tomorrow?" Tannis nodded. The sofa looked very comfortable, and she said so. "No, you take my bed. I made it up specially." Tannis slept well that night, right through to milking time, when she woke to the farmhouse door click closed. 88,888,888. Doug found her in the bathroom rinsing out the bottom sheet of the bedding in the sink with the soap she had found in the cupboard. "I'm sorry," Tannis called through, feeling so embarrassed at the mess everywhere. "Will the shop down at Butterton have something?" Tannis asked, glad there was a bathroom door between them. "Closed on a Sunday," Doug said, then a few minutes later knocked on the bathroom door and handed her a torn-up tea towel. "Until you get what you want," he explained, evenly, making Tannis feel even more embarrassed. Why hadn't she prepared for this? Schoolgirl error. Will that do year till year get to the shops? "Don't worry about the sheet," he added, when Tannis still hadn't emerged from the bathroom, 20 minutes later. When she finally did, sheet in hand, he pointed to the back door. "Put it to soak in the bucket out there. I've made up some lye solution. 'Twill come up white as anything." Tannis felt herself redden as she went off to do this, and on her return Doug handed her a cup of tea. "Don't you worry," Doug said, in a tone that was trying to make her feel at ease. "I have to know about theirs, for carving," he added. "But you don't have to know about mine," Tannis thought, blushing. "I've got to wait for the vet," Doug said, pouring himself another tea. "You can go walking yourself this morning if you want," he added, "then if all is all right with her, we can go over to Ilam." "What's wrong?" Tannis asked. noting that Doug's face was far from its usual one of relaxation. She's going to calf very soon. She's in a bit of discomfort. Usually calf in the spring, though they can calf in the autumn. Weather's not right for them, they deliver later, and they're bigger. You're going to have a calf? Denise asked, her face one of wonderment. But Doug looked away. I wish I'd never listened to Alfred, his ideas to increase milk yield, he added, bitterly. I was up all night with her. What can I do? Denise asked, to which Doug snapped back, not be here, go out for a while. Then he tried for a smile, which came out as a kind of grimace. Okay, Denise nodded, I'll be back this afternoon, okay? 88,888,888. Denise opened the farm gate, the hinges squeaking as she pushed on it, and closed it carefully behind her. Where to? She asked herself. The road to the right led down to the manifold and to the right was a long walk to Butterton. The sun shone on the landscape and she thought of Doug and the cow about to calve. Couldn't she have done anything to help him? Ahead of her the dominating spire atop the square tower of All Saints Church rose as if growing out of the landscape itself. Denise trod forwards, towards it. If she had come out earlier she could have joined the church service. As it was, the stream of people leaving by the north door indicated that the service was over. Denise looked at the people, counting maybe 30 of them, some piling back into Land Rovers but many of them walking. It was hard to imagine in the landscape which appeared at first glance to be so sparsely populated that so many people lived here and, too, attended church. The door of the church was still open when she arrived at its Gothic doorway. The light from the late morning sun lit the stained glass and illuminated the path inside. It was beautiful, and at that moment it occurred to Denise that the building was like a huge jewel, sitting proudly on this high point of land, visible to all in the surrounding countryside for miles. It was truly lovely. Inside, the church was just as beautiful. Whitewashed walls highlighted the stone archways. Tiles of dark red and blue-grey tessellated into alternating patterns ribboning off towards the pews. At the front, an oak altar behind which pale stained glass admitted the bright sunlight onto the woodwork and the red and grey tiles. The space within the church gave Denise the impression that she was standing not in a parish church but in a cathedral. On her right, in the recess of the wall, a cauldron-like bowl had been placed within it. On closer inspection Denise found a sign which told her that it was the church's original font dating from the 12th century. Despite them differing in age, the font was made of the same limestone as the interior stone. It was as if the church had been here forever, a part of the landscape itself, sculpted from the same rock under which the grass carpeted the gravestones. A glance to her left and Denise was told by the boards that the church was the latest that had been built in the site, thus one dating from the 1840s, and that there had been a church at this site since the 11th century. The board also asked her, as a visitor, to pay her respects to the remains of the crew of a plane that crashed in the 1947 winter which was trying to bring food to the stranded villagers. She walked up the central aisle to the altar section, feeling the grandeur and majesty of the place and, at the same time, the elegant simplicity. How many church services had taken place here to the glory of God? How many Easters? How many Christmases? How many baptisms, funerals, weddings? The jewel on the hill had opened its secrets to her. Maybe next time she was with Doug she would ask him to come over with her. Denise turned to go. The figure of a man at the back of the church made her jump. She nodded to him as she passed, and he turned, nodding back. When she reached the porch, however, Denise noticed he had followed her and she turned to say something. "Good morning," was all she managed, as their long, slow gaze of the man looking at her. Denise turned, thinking the man was looking at someone behind her, for he hadn't spoke to her. Then, she made to turn. "You're at the farm now, are you?" Denise turned, and the man, who was still staring at her, folded his arms. "I am visiting," Denise said, then turned to go. "I'm Alfred Peake. You met me sister, Margaret. D'you like it here?" "I'm friends with Doug Price," Denise said, waiting to see where this strange conversation was going. But the man said nothing more, instead, drew up his tweed hat in a kind of bow, then strode off between the gravestones. Wondering whether her walk was long enough for Doug, Tanis turned and made her way back to Clover Farm. 88,888,888. The cow had delivered her calf. A lot of mooing was being made down at the second cow shed, where the mother and calf were presumably being housed. Doug met her, his sleeves rolled up to the elbow and a satisfied look on his face. A bullock. It'll fetch a pretty penny in a few months. That's good then, Tanis nodded, then felt her heart sink. He'd want to stay with the new arrival and their walk to Ilam would be out. But Doug explained that the vet was going to stop with the mother and calf, and would she, Tanis, like to go to Ilam now? Otherwise it would be too late that afternoon. Tanis felt her spirits soar as they passed through the gate at the bottom of the lower gate and down still further onto the path that she and the walking Oati had taken in the opposite direction the time she had found Doug's farm on the first place. The way was hard going. Tanis was not used to the exertion and, by contrast, Doug was as sprightly as a mountain goat, and it was clear to her that he was having to drop his pace to continue to walk with her. The path they took was steep and led them over a bridge to Wetton, after which a steady climb over a gradually steepening hill got them to the Swiss cottages at the centre of the village. There was indeed an exhibition on Anglo-Saxon settlements in the Peak District at Ilam, and they looked around it before slipping into the grounds of the house by means of a nod and a wink to someone Doug knew. Neither of them were members, but Tanis would come to realize Doug knew everyone in the lower part of the Peak District and they knew him. That strange conversation at the church told her that, and Buzz yipped at their ankles, delighted to be going on a day trip, and lingered at the door of the tea shop. Tanis was about to find a table when Doug said, "Prefer a tea at home, truth be told, Tanis," and they set off on the 3-walk back. They took the steps down to the river, the Manifold now calmer as it joined with the Dove. There was a path that led through woodland. Doug helped her over a stile, laughing as she stumbled over hidden limestone in her most unsuitable shoes, and then held onto her hand for quite a long time after, as they walked past a high bank of rock long reclaimed by woodland. Tanis smiled at the horse in the field, walking over to it and leaped on the fence, looking at it longingly. "My aunt lived in the country," Tanis explained, as the horse ignored them and continued to demolish its hay pile by mouth. She was no farmer, but she liked the life. She had a horse. I loved him, loved going for a ride. I rode him a lot when I was young, but he broke a leg trying to jump her hedge. It broke my aunt's heart to put him down. She sold up and moved back to Southampton. "Horses are not worth anything," said Doug, dismissively, folding his hand over hers as she held the wooden rail. "They make nothing, they grow nothing of worth. Only if they are thoroughbreds and you can race them. They are beautiful. They're what ran the world before the car. The whole of Mercia depended on them," Chev added, citing the displays they'd just seen. "Aye," Doug nodded. "They were, once." And then Tanis told him of the man who had, if truth be told, scared her a little at the church that lunchtime. "We used to walk here, me, Tom Prince, Alfred, he's Catherine's brother, and Margaret is her sister, all 3 of us. We used to roam down here, fish with bent pins, make dams." "Sounds idyllic," Tanis mused as she thought of summer days long past and the fun 3 young boys could have unsupervised. Tom lived on a farm with his parents. Bought a place up Dark Peak. We'd come down here, for hours, sometimes sleep out in Thor's Cave. That's before the Peak District became overrun with tourists. "I'm sorry," Tanis said. Doug chuckled to himself, then continued. "Some Etons get the bus into the city and go to the disco. T-Rex were at Hanley Hall once. We went to see him." Doug stopped, then shook his head. "My own damned fault. It was going into business with Tom Prince. Stole the money we made together on a dairy freehold we set up, had to mortgage farm." He broke off suddenly, then looked up. The sheer cliffs that separated Holden from Wetton with the Manifold in between loomed like the treachery in Doug's short-lived reminiscence. "Come on, we'll go a different way," Doug said, heading down the hillside towards the Manifold River. "There's a passing place just up there, shallow enough to walk through," he explained, and put out a hand to guide her down the steep, scarp slope. The roar of the water filled her ears and she stripped off her shoes and socks, rolling up her trousers to stop them getting too wet. Doug, however, tramped straight through, Buzz at his side, and was waiting for her, arms folded, on the other side. The water was cold and refreshing, and Tannis's feet felt light and fresh once she got to the other bank. The steep cliffs tower this side looked even more unwelcome rock face, and Tannis looked up, wondering how they were ever going to get up to the top, on which Haldon sat. "Come on!" shouted Doug, tiring of Tannis's slowness at putting on her shoes, and she ran to his side as she looked up again. "How will we?" she began, but her words were halted abruptly when Doug sank his mouth onto hers, pressing firm and fast, tangling his fingers in her hair. Time stopped. He reached down and fondled her bum, pulling her hips towards his, and she kissed him back more as his hands moved to her hips and then up the sides of her body. And then just as suddenly he stopped, and was hurrying towards a gap in the rocks. Tannis chased after him. He bounded up with the lightness of foot she would have expected of a man half his age. Before them were a set of steps which wound their way between them, curling up to they climbed. Dug her up the last few steps. The sun was bright and warm. Tannis recognized that they were at the bottom of the footpath which led to the right over the footbridge and, to the left, rising steadily, towards Clover Farm. "Last one to the farm makes the tea," Doug declared. 1, 2, 3. Tannis shouted gleefully, pushing him playfully in chest, sprinting past him and up towards the farm. Doug eventually caught up with her by the gate at the bottom, pulling her down by the hips. "That," he said, "was cheating," he laughed. "This is what we do to cheats here." He knelt astride her, bending to kiss her, enveloping his lips in hers. When he broke off, Tannis leaned up to stroke his bristly cheek. "I won," she proclaimed, but her asserting was challenged when Doug began to tickle her. "Stop, stop." Tannis laughed, looking into his eyes, which were alive with mischief. "Only when you agree that you are a rotten cheat, Tannis Haviland." Tannis made the tea. The bullock and its mother were doing well, Doug proclaimed when he returned after checking all was well, and they talked about him growing up in Haldon with his sister, and how he never wanted to be anywhere else. His mum had taught him at home and had gone by bus every day to Stone High School. Catherine's father had been his science teacher. "I remember," Doug laughed, as if recalling the memory in his mind and reciting to Tannis the events. "He smacked one kid in the face one day and he fell off his chair. Funniest thing I'd ever seen." "Bet he didn't think so," said Tannis, sipping her tea. "Or, it was okay. He was a sly little bugger, wound up the other kids and stood back to watch the trouble he'd caused. But that day he'd crossed Mr. Pike. Dunno exactly what he'd done. Probably let his tires down or summit. Harry did love his car." "Your wife's dad was your teacher?" "None of us knew it then. There was me, his son Arthur, and Tom, thick as thieves. Spent our lives together." "And you keep in touch now?" asked Tannis, dimly aware that he had mentioned Tom Prince had swindled him over their business venture. "And Michael Sharrock too. Poor Michael. Was in army. Discharged due to ill health, after the Falklands War, after the liberation of Port Stanley. It screwed him up so much, shot himself. Tom cleared off up to Dark Peak." Doug shook his head. "I'm boring myself, so you must be bored." Tannis, rising, then putting down his teacup in the sink, added, "Want to come out and see the new arrival? 88,888,888. Come out, tonight," Scarlett begged, as Tannis had answered the phone. "Look, we're worried about you, and I'm not afraid to ask you what the hell is going on." It was Sunday night, and the last place Tannis wanted to be was back in her flat contemplating week 2 of a conference that her heart was not in, having read the report that they would be laying people off. She had seen it, that weekend, life, raw and fresh and real as she spent it on the farm, that weekend. It had felt more real to her than anything. More real to her than faux friendships in the name of ensuring you were not in the list for the chop, playing politics to avoid job loss. Not that she could afford to lose her job, but the means to try to ensure it were beyond her. Well, I've met a wonderful man and I'm enjoying my time in his company, Tanis began. But Scarlet interrupted her, shrieking with laughter. You don't mean that old farmer? She snorted. Doug is not old, Tanis protested. We are just friends. Look, I know how you felt about Phil, but you don't need to get into bed with the first man you see. So, you coming round, then? Yes, agreed Tanis, and I have not got into bed with Doug yet, Scarlet goaded. And Tanis felt angry. He's just a friend, Tanis shot back. I'll be with you in half an hour. She paused, then added sharply, there is nothing going on with me and Doug. And, as she said goodbye to her best friend, Tanis held her head in her hands. For she knew deep down that that was not quite how it was.